Hi friends, thank you for taking time out of your week to spend a little with me. I appreciate you. We're going to discuss the murder of 4-year-old Kaylee Poulton. This case was suggested by fellow viewer Wendy, so thank you for sharing this tragic crime with all of us. As always, I invite you to join me as we remember Kaylee Poulton. Kaylee Ann Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989 in Rochester, New York to parents Judy Gifford and David Poulton. Judy and David separated in 1992 but remained on friendly terms. Kaylee lived with Judy in an apartment complex called Gleason Estates in Rochester, New York. Kaylee was her mother's only child and her everything. In fact, anyone who met Kaylee adored her. Kaylee was described as having a bubbly personality and just an all-around happy child. Judy worked part-time placing inserts in magazines in order to save extra money. She'd planned to take Kaylee on a surprise trip to Disney. The evening of May 23, 1994 was much like any other. Around 6:45 p.m., Judy was finishing up her work when Kaylee asked if she could go outside and play with her pink big wheel. Judy usually did not allow Kaylee to play outside alone, but decided this one time would be fine. It was the summer, so daylight hours were longer, so she made a deal with Kaylee that as long as she rode her big wheel on the sidewalk in front of the house, she could go outside. Judy was pretty much done with her work, and she felt safe since she could pop her head out and see Kaylee. She was very protective of her daughter. Judy planned to deliver her magazines, then spend the evening with Kaylee at the playground after grabbing some McDonald's for dinner. Kaylee was only outside a few minutes by herself. As Judy started to load her car up, she called out to Kaylee that it was time to go, but she received no reply. This sent Judy into panic mode. She knew something was wrong. She called Kaylee's name throughout the complex, frantically searching. Nearby neighbors heard the mother's concerned voice and quickly joined the search. Judy called the police right away while the neighborhood continued to look. 20 minutes into the search, Judy ran into her newest neighbor, Mark Christie, who was taking his 18-month-old son to the playground at the time. He joined the residents of Gleason Estates 6 weeks prior with his girlfriend and son, and was no stranger to Judy and Kaylee since Kaylee often played with his son at the playground. Judy asked Mark if he had seen Kaylee. She noticed Mark didn't tie the laces on his shoes, which seemed odd. But Mark replied that he had not seen Kaylee and continued to walk towards the park. Police were searching the property with canines and going door to door to question each resident in the complex. But sadly, nothing came of their extensive efforts. That night, Judy stayed awake all night worrying, her little girl being out there all alone and scared. The following day, detectives with the Monroe County Sheriff's Department returned to Judy's home for additional questioning. Initially, detectives had nothing to go on. There were no signs of abduction or struggle. They really had no leads. Since Judy was the last person to see Kaylee, they started to turn their focus on her as a suspect. During the questioning, Judy was asked if she could think of anyone who might want to take Kaylee. She could only come up with one person, Mark Christie. She explained Mark made her uncomfortable. After about half a dozen conversations at the playground, he made admiring remarks about Kaylee. He told Judy her daughter was a very precious girl, and that he looked at all the little girls on the playground, and Kaylee was by far the prettiest. Most disturbing, however, was Mark asking Judy if Kaylee would tell her if anyone tried to touch her. Judy quickly replied yes. She explained how disturbed she felt after that encounter, and she actively went out of her way to avoid crossing paths with him. Police made contact with Mark immediately after interviewing Judy. Mark was interviewed for several hours but denied any involvement in Kaylee's disappearance. A further look into Mark revealed he did have a criminal record, but none of his offenses involved children. Mark was able to provide an alibi, which Judy also corroborated since she saw him on his way to the park. Beyond his very odd comments, investigators had nothing to prove Mark was responsible, but he remained a person of interest. The search for Kaylee was extensive. The community worked with law enforcement to distribute nearly 1 million posters across the country. Her mother quit her job and started the Kaylee Search Center, which was staffed by volunteers who worked tirelessly to keep Kaylee's name and image in the public eye. Judy even convinced airlines to place Kaylee's picture in the ticket sleeves in case anyone tried to leave the state with her. She also went on any talk show who would listen to Kaylee's story and was able to get Kaylee featured on America's Most Wanted. Despite these efforts and dozens of people interviewed, investigators were no closer to finding Kaylee, but Judy remained hopeful. Days after Kaylee's disappearance, Mark Christie was evicted from his apartment, allegedly due to complaints of Mark exposing himself to 2 girls. He moved to the rural hamlet of Gananda, about 15 miles east of Rochester, and at this point, Mark was pretty much written off by those investigating Kaylee's disappearance, except for 2 investigators, Thomas Passmore and Patrick Crow, who felt Mark lied from the beginning. But due to the lack of evidence and because they did not want Mark to lawyer up, they decided not to pursue him for the time being. Instead, the investigators kept Mark close, letting him know they were there when he was ready to talk about the case. This relationship spanned nearly 2 years before the wait finally paid off. On August 9, 1996, Mark and his wife of only 3 weeks, Lacey Ann, got into a fight. She was prepared to leave him due to his odd behavior. No one is sure why, maybe to garner sympathy, but during the heat of the argument, Mark blurted out that he was responsible for Kaylee's death. But this did not play in his favor. In fact, it did the opposite. Lacey was horrified. She left the home going to her parents' house where she called 911. Due to laws in New York, admissions to spouses are considered private and protected, and since Mark provided no details regarding the crime, there was no guarantee a conviction could be made if taken to trial. Rather than wait for Mark to be taken in by police, Investigator Crow decided to go and interview Mark, a day in which he detailed in his book, Seducers Among Our Children. Despite Mark's mother being present at the house and telling Crow he was not going to go with him, Mark decided to take a ride with Crow with the promise that he could go to his attorney's office after. Mark decided he would tell Crow everything after speaking to his attorney, but Crow knew he would learn nothing if that happened, so he continued to push him, explaining to Mark how sad it was that Kaylee's parents would never know what happened to her, or if she suffered, to which Mark replied she didn't suffer. While driving, Crow decided to take Mark for lunch in an attempt to make him feel more comfortable, which did end up working in his favor. Mark became an open book. Mark told Crow for the last 2 years he had been living in a nightmare, being forced to see Kaylee's face everywhere on posters and TV, but yet also a sense of pride knowing he had beaten the cops. Appealing to his need to feel in control, Crow played along with Mark. Mark started providing details in a bragging manner, explaining how he removed Kaylee's big wheel without anyone even noticing. He had it in his home for 3 days after he killed Kaylee. He asked Crow if he wanted to know how he did it, and Crow said sure. Mark stated he broke the toy down into pieces and put them in different spots to hide them in his house, since he figured the police wouldn't be looking for small pieces. Then, as time passed, he started removing them one by one, placing them in bags with other items such as clothing. He was able to go right through police roadblocks this way, and once he was in the clear, he tossed the bike pieces throughout the county as he drove. Crow explained to Mark he should consider getting out his side of the story to get ahead of the public backlash, so they wouldn't see him as a monster. Crow wanted Mark to feel like Kaylee's death wasn't entirely his fault, despite his personal feelings towards Mark. This tactic seemed to work since Mark asked if he wanted to know the details of what happened. Mark wanted to make it clear that Kaylee didn't suffer. He stated he strangled Kaylee and did not do anything further to her. Kaylee drove her big wheel over to his apartment that day to play with his son. Since Mark knew Judy would not want her daughter at his home, he decided to bring her big wheel into his kitchen so no one would know she was over there. She then went upstairs to play while Mark went to the room across the hall. 10 minutes later, he heard Judy calling Kaylee's name. Mark claimed he panicked, fearing he would get in trouble if he was caught with Kaylee, so he strangled her to death. He stated he felt like he was in a dream during the murder. Afterwards, Mark carried Kaylee's body downstairs where he put her on the floor in the dining room, before grabbing his son and heading outside to take him to the playground. After returning home, Mark placed Kaylee into a laundry basket and put blankets on top of her before putting the basket in his trunk. At the time, he worked for the Nortel Company as a security guard, and decided this would be the best place to hide Kaylee until he could figure something else out. So he and his son drove in the middle of the night. When he arrived at the Nortel company, he told the staff on duty he left something behind and needed to grab it. So they let him in. Through the back door, he was able to sneak the basket inside. He climbed to the top of a 30,000-gallon coolant tank and placed Kaylee inside after tying a piece of metal equipment to her body to weigh her down. He told Crow it should have never happened and it was a waste. Crow drove Mark back to the police station where he was given the phone to call his attorney. Afterwards, he was officially placed under arrest for the murder of Kaylee Ann Poulton. Officially charged with first-degree murder, Mark was given a plea deal of second-degree murder if he pled guilty, to which he agreed. In October of 1997, Mark Christie pled guilty to the murder of Kaylee and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He is serving his sentence at the Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York. Years after Mark's arrest, new information came forward regarding a separate case which occurred in 1988. 74-year-old Viola Manville was murdered when she was shot by a BB gun, then beaten to death. At the time, Mark was the prime suspect. He apparently bragged to friends about being involved, but when another man, Frank Sterling, confessed to the murder, Mark was let go. Frank was convicted in 1991 and sent to prison, but in 2010, new DNA evidence ruled Frank out as the murderer. It eventually came out that Frank's original confession was coerced. Mark was tested against this new evidence, which actually helped tie him to the crime. He was questioned further where he confessed and even provided details which were not public knowledge. In September of 2011, Mark pled guilty to the murder of Viola Manville and was sentenced to 20 years to life in October of 2011. This new sentence is set to run consecutively with his first sentence. Mark will be eligible for parole in 2041. Kaylee's body was recovered and given a proper burial. She was placed to rest at the Oddfellows Rest Cemetery in Columbus, Texas. Judy went on to marry her husband of more than 20 years, Floyd Tosh, and she did not have any more children, but instead chose to be the best aunt to her nieces and nephews. Judy tried to not let Kaylee's death consume her, because Mark is not worth it. She stated, quote, "If I took my own life, which I contemplated, then you won. You took her life, and you're not taking the rest of mine. That's where I stand strong." End quote. Hi friends, if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Also, thank you again, Wendy, for sharing Kaylee's story with all of us. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this case, so please share them below and we can chat. If you found this to be informative, please consider giving the video a thumbs up. And lastly, if you're not subscribed yet, you should, because we would love to have you under the ash tree. Thank you everyone for your love and support as always to the channel. You are all the best, and I hope you're having an awesome week ahead of you. But for now, stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, friends.